Welcome all to our second installment of Chorale Conversations. I'm Yavar Maradi, the Marketing and Box Office Manager for the Santa Fe Desert Chorale. And once again, I'm speaking with Joshua Habermann, the Desert Chorale's Artistic Director and Primary Conductor. Josh, for our conversation today, I thought let's talk about what you see as some of the unique things about the world of choral music in particular and what it has to offer us in these unusual times we're living in.
Sure. Well, I can talk first about what originally attracted me to it and start by touching on something that we spoke about last week, which was that unique combination of words and music that choral music gives us. Mm-hmm. I started out learning the piano, and I love the piano, but I always loved singing more. And I think for me that had to do with the fact that it combined my love of poetry and of literature and of stories, with this beautiful music. So we can all imagine, as I was playing piano, I would imagine, a scene, or I could associate it with images, but choral music makes those things explicit, and it connects us specifically to the stories of other people. And that to me was really meaningful and impactful, because suddenly I could hear, a piece, let's say by an Estonian composer from 80 years ago who I'd never met and I'd never been to Estonia. And yet I heard in the story of the words said, thou great mountain that I climb on this day. And I could look out my window and I could see Mount Tam, over the bay in San Francisco, and think, of course, to climb a mountain, to see it. These are the stories that choral music can somehow connect us through and create bridges to other cultures and other times.
And do you feel like, I guess the language is never a barrier in that case, or was this a case where you knew the language, or you looked up a translation and it connected to you because you could hear the meaning that was being communicated in the expression of it?
Yeah, well, all the above. As you know, I'm a little bit of a language fanatic, and so I have some facility to be able to understand a lot of these texts, but not all of them, certainly at all. Mm-hmm. And so I definitely have that feeling sometimes where I listen to a piece and I think, wow, I don't know what it means, but it's just beautiful. And I can feel that emotion from the beauty without necessarily knowing the words. Mm-hmm. But I also know that my experience of that music is enhanced and is deepened by my understanding of the words, especially because that's probably where the composer started. Mm-hmm. Almost every composer that writes vocal music isn't starting with a tune and then fitting some words to it. It really works the other way, where we start with the words and the words of the inspiration, and then the music comes through that. So for me, I always make it a point to understand the words of what I'm hearing or what I'm programming, what I'm listening to, because I know that's what the composer likely did as well.
Mm-hmm. So what's like the distinction for you between, vocal music of any kind and, say, programmatic music that's instrumental in nature? Is it that the culture is more present with the vocal element, or, either the language or just the literature, the poetry and such of a place is present? What kind of is that special element for you that makes it distinct from other programmatic music?
Well, I think it's the human voice, and the human connection. I love orchestral music, and when I'm not working with the Desert Chorale, I work with the symphony chorus. And so we do a lot of symphonic music and orchestral music, and I love it. Mm-hmm. And there's all those pieces, those orchestral pieces that have explicit programs. Beethoven's Sixth Symphony is that famous example where it's a depiction of a storm, and of course it's wonderful, and I love it. But for me, my greatest love and my greatest attraction has always been to the human voice, particularly because there's no intervening instrument. There's no additional level that we have to communicate through. If I'm playing the piano, I'm working through the piano to try and express what it is that I'm trying to say. But in the human voice, of course, our body and ourself, we are the instrument. And there's an immediacy there, and there's a personality there that is immediately accessible to a listener when they're looking at somebody singing that's a little different, and I would say more direct, mm-hmm. than somebody who is putting that expression through an instrument. So for me, that's the difference, and I've always been attracted to that.
Yeah, in many ways, it does seem like it can be the most personal way of musical communication, because everyone's voice is incredibly unique. And it's not that I'm saying you can't tell the difference between Jascha Heifetz's violin playing and somebody else's, but there's something a little bit more apparent to even anyone who's not musically literate or experienced, and being able to, you know, pick out the unique voice of each performer. And so every time at one of your concerts, when you have a moment for a soloist to step forward and kind of shine out, I love those moments because it feels like a way of, you know, connecting personally with that singer in particular.
Absolutely. And I think we as humans crave that contact.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's making these days so difficult for so many of us.
Yeah.
Is that we are somewhat isolated. And so although we're able to connect as we can, you know, through the computer, as you're doing today with me in my home office, and you hear the dogs in the background and kids playing downstairs, you know, there's something sort of beautiful about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still that human contact, that in-person contact that we crave, you know. And choral music gives that to us in a way that nothing else does. As you said, if you're sitting in a Desert Chorale concert and you look up, and whether it's the group performing or whether it's a particular individual or a soloist that you hone in on, you feel that person at a soul level. And so many of our patrons report this. They say, I have to sit in a certain seat because I always want to be either close or far enough away, or, you know, whatever it is, but I want to be able to view it as I like to view it, because I want to see that physical, visual, as well as the oral connection, and make that possible. And that's what people are craving now. I mean, those of us who can't be performing artists for now, you know, are hearing so much from our patrons and our supporters saying, we just can't wait for the Desert Chorale to get back. Not because we can't listen to recordings. We love listening to the recordings, and they're absolutely beautiful, and they remind us of these experiences, but it's really that experience, that particular connection, and that story that you tell through the music that is so meaningful to us.
I wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite pieces of vocal music storytelling?
Oh, well, there's a million of them. And I think anything that lifts us up, that ennobles us, that reminds us that we belong to something greater than ourselves, which of course is a basic human need. That is the essence of a compelling story. I think now back to maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, we did a program called American Voices, in which we took a lot of American composers and we shared that. And that's something Desert Chorale is really committed to, is bringing American composers to the forefront, since we're one of the great American chamber choirs.
You took that on a tour, right?
Yes, we did. This particular program wasn't the one that we toured later, but this is all the same, one of our great American programs. And I started with a piece called Little Fish, which is this great piece by David Montoya. David's a composer in California, where I'm from. And he wrote a piece for his newborn son. And he said, little fish, you know, referring to this little tiny creature that had just come into his life. And of course, I saw my story in that, because my children are young now. And at that time, my little boy was just born. My daughter was probably 3 or 4, and he was just, you know, 1, if that. And so when I read that poem and I heard that piece, I felt my story being amplified through somebody else's experience. And I thought, oh, this is me. Mm-hmm. And then of course, it's not just me, it's everybody. It's all of us. It's anybody who's experienced that parenthood or that caring for a smaller creature. And I thought, well, what could this lead to, right? What could we connect it with? Because what we try and do in the Desert Chorale especially is to not just have what often choral concerts can be, which is 3 minutes of music and then a response for applause, and then 3 minutes of music and a response for applause. And somehow that seems to be, it doesn't generate a lot of depth and length of listening. Mm-hmm. So what we try and do is weave pieces together in such a way that there can be a meaningful narrative. And so as I went from that Little Fish and I was trying to create a program around it, I thought, okay, what else goes here? And then I thought, well, there's this wonderful piece by Sean Crouch that I knew. Sean is a young composer, American, and he had written a piece on poetry that was by his, I don't recall now if it was his brother, I believe it was his brother, a close relative in any case, who had served in Iraq. during the Desert Storm.
Mhm.
And the soldier had written a poem from the point of view of seeing an Iraqi family. And I remember the first line is Habib stirs the father's name, I don't recall in the moment, stirs the chai and tells his sleeping 4-year-old, Habib, that the sound of guns and explosions are really just a strange new music. And so you see a father trying to comfort a child in the worst possible circumstances. And of course I thought of this and I saw my son's life in it. You know, some years now, you know, down the road, he's a 6-year-old, he's a 4-year-old, he's a 5-year-old. And what would it be like to have that experience? And suddenly I found myself in the presence of that person living that life. And it was through that music. And I thought, okay, well, where does that story go? And then I imagined, the end of that father's life. There's a wonderful Randy Newman tune. Randy Newman's a 70s pop icon.
Yeah.
But the King Singers did an arrangement of his tune called Texas Girl at the Funeral of Her Father. And I thought, wouldn't that be a fascinating next step, that we fast forward now in this human journey to the moment when here's the daughter now, in this case, not the son, but the child all the same, saying goodbye to a parent, to a cherished relationship. And we had our own Kathleen Rich sing that solo, which will always be memorable to me, as she stepped out and sang, here I am, lost in the world, saying goodbye to this beloved person. And of course, the roles have changed. Yeah. And now it's no longer the parent caring for the child, but rather the child saying goodbye to that parent. And even now I remember it and I'm moved by that memory, and realize that that's my story too, because that time will come for me and for my kids, as it does for all of us. And so I thought, well, where could that story go? And we don't want to leave people in that sad place necessarily, and what might be next. And then I thought about Jake Runestad's piece, So I Go On, which was written for loss, acknowledging loss, and yet saying, and yet I will continue, my life will continue. And so we set that next, and that seemed to naturally lead in my mind into I'll Be On My Way, which Desert Chorale fans may remember from our 2017 recording, a great setting by Sean Kirchner, which is now the voice of the person who has passed, saying, when I am gone, don't cry for me, but remember all the good that was in our lives, and remember this shared glorious place where I now am. And suddenly I felt like this is an entire story. This is a life lived. And it's all through choral music, and it's all through the power of story. Do I know any of these people? I don't know Randy Newman. I've never lived in West Texas. None of that is my story, and yet it's all my story. And it's yours, and it's ours. And so I think that's the power of choral music, and that's the power of choral music, particularly now in a pandemic time, when we're isolated and when we're apart, to hear these songs sung again, and to realize that we're not alone, that our story is everyone's story, and that we will come back together to sing once more.
I love these moments of both connection and comfort that can be offered. And you having a special gift for stringing them together in a concert in a, all these different voices, not just of the singers, but these different voices of the composers and the poets represented. How you can create that journey is really an important gift you've brought to us over the years. So thank you for that. And thank you for talking with me today about it.
It's a great chance to get to share this with you. Thanks so much.
All right.